Good morning or good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. It tends to be my usual opening these days. So welcome to our next Rebellious Research Seminar series with a person I really was looking forward to to have us join this seminar. Scott McLaughlin, who is going to be talking about optimism in a fragmented landscape of practice research. A really fascinating person who is doing really amazing research and projects, as we'll hear very soon. Something that will help really every single person who works within creative practice. So I'm sorry if I introduce you with such a high expectation here, Scott, but I'm sure that what you're going to be talking about is just going to be just absolutely fascinating, because obviously we had those conversations many times in the background. So really delighted to have you here today and really looking forward to your talk. So without further ado, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and the next hour or so is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for having me here. I've loved this series for a long time. You've been putting on so much good stuff and such a diversity of things. So I'm really excited to be here and talking to people. I'll share slides in a moment. I guess I should start just by positioning myself a little bit so you know where this is coming from. I'm an Irish composer. I've been in the UK about 20 years. I've been in academia. Well, I finished my PhD in 2009, and I've been at the University of Leeds pretty much ever since. I should also say I'm looking at two separate screens here, so if I start looking in different directions, that's just because my screens are higgledy-piggledy. I'm primarily coming in as a composer. I work in a school of music. I mostly teach people how to compose, but also within that area, within the University of Leeds, I direct a center for practice research, which sits across multiple schools. So our job within the University of Leeds, the job of CEPRA, the Centre for Practice Research, is essentially to try and do support work across all of the disciplines, which means also a lot of work of translating and understanding what is different for, say, media from fine art, um, all of these different disciplines, and focusing also on, and I know I'm not using this word quite the way it's usually used, the transdisciplinary. So the things where we all, as practice researchers, share certain things that we're trying to do, irrespective of what domain we work within. So a lot of the work of the center is trying to, put on talks, fund people coming in, but particularly as we approach a ref cycle, the ref is going to come up. We can't avoid it. Particularly as we're coming into a ref cycle, there's a lot of also work in just supporting people understanding what they're trying to do to fit through the hoop that is ref, which involves also liaising with the library. I'm going to be talking quite a lot about that as we come on. But essentially what I'm really interested in is trying to get both the policy layer right. How are practice researchers being supported in general on a national and even an international level? What are the tools we need? How do we make it work for everybody? And people outside academia, we'll come back to that at some point, but also just on the very ground roots level, how do we help someone? I mean, I encounter all the time colleagues, everything from early career researchers, PhD students, up to full professors who do wonderful research, and then it comes down to this moment of refness, and they're like, "Oh my God, what are we supposed to do with this now? How do we fit things in the box, etc." And also, with the best will in the world, most of our research support ecosystems don't really know what we do, don't quite understand it, stick it off in weird boxes, thinking it's some sort of public engagement or impact work, etc. So we have all of that, and this is partly why the title of the talk I gave this was about optimism in this fragmented landscape. To position myself again a little bit, I joined. I didn't really understand this when I was doing my PhD, and it was only as I started entering being a full-time academic that I started working out where practice research sits and how I was even really thinking about what I do as research. And it was then when the PRAG-UK work, I don't know if people are familiar with PRAG-UK, it's the Practice Research Advisory Group. I think you've possibly had some people on from that before. They did wonderful work coming up to the last ref in just trying to sit down and say, can we all agree some basic terms and stop disagreeing about sheer terminology? Can we just help each other by trying to just agree some basics? And this again comes back to the transdisciplinary element. How do we respect individual because ultimately we're all artists, we are all individualists, yet at the same time we have to kind of group together and help each other by agreeing some basic terms and some basic principles about what we're doing. So, and I will mention the Prague reports a little bit as we go on, but that was a real cornerstone for me, attending some of the Prague things and seeing these conversations that were happening and seeing people from fine art, etc., different disciplines trying to find meeting points and agreements. So some of the work I did with that really spun into, I was very much at a low level of that. I wasn't involved in any sense. I was just attending things. But watching that was really, really interesting. And that's then when we tried to bring some of that back into Leeds and ramp up what we were doing here and think about it more in terms of a support thing. So the positioning here I'm trying to put in is that over the last few years, particularly, since I joined the PRAG-UK steering committee a couple of years ago. I've also been involved in a bunch of other projects, which I'm going to talk about today. A lot of this is trying to lead towards something where it's easier for everyone to come on board into practice research. It's easier for everyone to understand what the goals are while still respecting the individual differences about what we're all trying to achieve in our research. On that note, let me fire up some slides and go from there. Let's see if this worked as well as it did a minute ago. There's some emails. Okay. Agatha, can you give me a thumbs up if you're seeing just my title?
Yeah.
Cool. In theory, cool. Let's try that again. There we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the first 10 or 15 minutes here are going to be maybe a little bit anecdotal. I'm going to talk about the fragmentation issues and primarily from the perspective both of myself as a researcher and myself as a PhD supervisor and examiner, and equally with respect to the wider multidisciplinary side of things. And then I'm going to talk about what we're what the general community, I think, of people trying to come up with ways to combat this are doing. Some of the things we know about, although this is also part of the fragmentation issue. The fact that I know about this podcast is fantastic. The fact that I know about one or two others, but ultimately there's just so much going on around the country and people generally not talking to each other because they don't know other people are doing things. So I'm going to talk about a couple of specific projects, the Practice Research Diaries project that we did here at Leeds recently, and also the Sparkle and PR Voices projects, which again, you might be familiar with already, some of you, so apologies if I'm going over old ground, but I think it helps to see what's been happening. And finally, I'm going to talk about a thing called Enact, which is we just received funding in the last couple of months to start developing a repository for practice research, a digital repository for practice research, which we hope will go some way towards solving a lot of these problems, or at least enabling a system that enables people to solve these problems. That's the plan. So let me talk a little bit about fragmentation. Do I have a slide for this? Yeah. The thing that I see most, whether this be, like I say, from PhD students, even going further down, from master's students, from undergraduate students, trying to do research in an area where they themselves are the practitioner and they're researching themselves and the things that they are doing, in a larger field of other people about this is trying to see who else is doing the work. A fundamental research element is how does my work fit inside a field? How can I make a claim that the work that I'm doing is novel and that it's making a contribution if I cannot define a field within which it is novel, or fields? This is, of course, something where also there's a fundamental difference between what I'm trying to do as a professional artist, as a composer. In that sense, there is a fieldness to what I do as a composer, but I don't have to demonstrate in any way or convince anybody that what I'm doing is in some way novel. People respond to the art. It means something to them. Its novelty, etc., is potentially important individually or to institutions or to other things, but there's no actual onus on me to say, yes, please fund this work. It is going to do something new, which is what happens in research. And equally, the other thing that distinguishes research from somebody working purely in an artistic, industrial, professional field is that there is no onus on the professional artist to share anything they are doing other than the work itself, and not necessarily even that. Whereas a researcher, our entire job to be able to say that what we do as a practitioner is also research is that we share things. We put out our ideas, we don't hide stuff. We don't have to put out all of our ideas, but the whole point is to be able to share with a community of people to advance knowledge. So in order to do that, we have to know what other knowledge is out there. And it is singularly difficult to find this, to know who else is asking the same questions as me, who else is asking, is trying to solve, well, I won't say solve the same problems. That feels a little bit like a STEM answer, but who's digging in the same areas, who's sniffing around the same thoughts and trying to see what happens if we push this boundary or that boundary. It is singularly difficult to find that even within my own domain, much less someone who's asking the same questions but is in a totally different field. And there's a bunch of reasons for this, which we'll come back to in a moment. But then there's also the question of the work itself. Can I actually access it? What if I hear about somebody doing some work, or I find a reference to somebody doing something that seems relevant? Is that art still available? Did I have to be there for the one performance that happened in a basement somewhere in Colchester? Was there a video? Is the video any good? Is the video available online? Can I still access it? Does the video actually tell me what I need? Is experiencing the artwork itself enough, or do I actually need the researcher to also guide me, to have questions out there, to have thoughts out there in some other medium that isn't necessarily the artwork itself? All of these things that are completely normal in almost any other research endeavor are just so difficult to find in a lot of cases in our areas. Of course, yes, there are journals, and sometimes stuff gets into journals, but there's, and this may differ for your fields, but certainly in the field of music composition, there are vanishingly few journals. And even when there are, they tend to be very, very sporadic and diverse in what they include in them. So it's difficult to establish really who is doing specific things in specific areas or who's asking questions. There is, of course, a ton of wonderful art out there, but again, it's often very difficult, even if these people are explicitly trying to address this as research, it's very difficult sometimes to find what their actual research questions are, or even if they're not phrased as a question, what their topics are, what they're trying to get at through doing this thing, which may relate to the art itself or may actually be part of the process or something else to do with that. As a perfect example of this, I just last year came across a wonderful composition by a US composer, and I went to dig into it a bit more, and all I could find was a video, and that told me some things, but I really needed to understand how she had made the things she'd made in order to get at the information that I needed, because it seemed like what she was doing is very close to what I was doing. So I wanted to understand better where she was coming from. So I dug around, and it turned out she'd done a PhD at a US institution. So I went to look for her thesis, nothing. Library had nothing. There was nothing in there. There was a reference to it, but it was fully embargoed. So eventually I just contacted the composer myself and said, oh, I see that you've got a thesis on this. Is it possible that you can share this? Is there somewhere I can get access to this? And she said, oh, in our institution, you don't have to write a written thesis. It's just the music. I just made the music. And while I did then manage to, through email, ask her some questions and get a little bit somewhere, it just seemed like, well, that's it. So there's all of this knowledge went into that thing she made in a research context, and then whoosh, it just all vanished. It all disappeared away. Unless she in some way describes it or writes it down or elucidates it further or gives something more about it, it's just gone. I constantly come up with PhD students, whether it's my own students or whether it's in examination, where they make great reference to, say, other composers, other pieces of music from 30, 40, 50 years ago, because there's books written about them and there's articles written about them. And then I say, what about now? Who's doing this work now? Point me to the other composers or even people outside music who are doing this work. And often they struggle. They might come up with one or two examples that are maybe already in the written commentary, but so often they just can't find them. It's not from want of looking. You go to an artist's website, might say something about it. You maybe get lucky enough to see a talk that gets recorded. Yeah. I could go on and on about this, but I find it singularly difficult to actually find things, to know who is out there doing the same things, to be able to define a field, which I think is a very great problem for us. And I don't think it can be solved by just having more journals or more stuff online. Part of the solution, I think, is a repository, but also I'm saying this because I'm a co-lead on a repository project. So for us, this is a place where we think we should put our resources to try and address some of these questions, to make it easier to find and connect people doing all of this work. So there is also the question in this about how people want to address these issues. Many people look at this and think, well, this is just going to take a lot more work, isn't it? I'm going to have to do different things. Making the artwork in itself was enough. Wasn't it enough that I just made the thing and put it out there? And in some cases, of course, it is. But I think there's part of the issue is that when we have things that we want to talk about, there are so few ways to get it out there, unless you write a journal article or a book chapter, which of course could take several years or not come out at all, or require some sort of funding, etc. The avenues for us to get these things out are quite difficult. So what does happen, of course, is sometimes they appear on blogs. Often these days they appear in social media posts, digging around through Instagram or Facebook to find somewhere where someone has talked about these things. Part of, I think, the argument I'm trying to make in all of this, and you'll see this more when we get into talking about the repository, is that this is work a lot of us are doing anyways. We're already talking about these things, but often we're either talking to just friends or general public through social media, or we're talking directly to the art audiences themselves, concert audiences, exhibition audiences. And these are not necessarily the same as a research audience. We don't talk to them in the same way. We don't bring up the same things. So research ideas tend to sit buried under other forms of engagement. So part of what's trying to be solved with the repository is to be able to make it easy for people to put this stuff out there in some form. But I'll come back to that in a bit. So the question of fragmentation was at least a little bit dealt with by the PRAG-UK reports, which if you haven't read them, they're quite long, but they really captured, I think, a moment in thought, very wonderfully written and wonderfully researched as a way of trying to define what it actually is in 2021. When we say we're doing practice research in the UK, what is this? What is it that we actually mean? And can we agree some basic terms? And it tried to do, did I put up this slide? Yes. It tried to get around, at least, if nothing else, this one problem right off the bat. Loads and loads of different terms. I have wasted so many hours of my life in conversations and discussion on practice research talks where in an hour-long talk we lose half an hour just with people trying to define if it's practice-led, is it practice-based, is it something else. All of this terminological discussion was just getting us nowhere. Of course, there's probably some very good examples out there where this terminological distinction really is useful, but it seemed that particularly in discussions with research support, people who are outside practice but who have some sort of, research managers, libraries, etc., this was always a big stumbling block. How do we actually talk about this when there were all of these different identities for things out there? So one of the first things the PRAG-UK report says is, let's just, for the moment, just push past that and let's call it all practice research and worry about specific terms in specific cases if needed. And I think this is something that's slowly percolating through, particularly again to research support, etc., to try to not get bogged down in these terminological discussions. The other things that this is just giving you some of the headlines of what's contained within the reports. But the thing it really tries to do, and from talking to multiple people at multiple levels across practice research disciplines, is to just try and get a snapshot of what is it that we mean when we're talking about this. That can be as broad as possible. Right off the bat, they say this is not just for academics. This is for people who do artistic practice, and outside that, people working in clinicians, social workers, anyone who is working in a practice, in a practical context. But also it's trying to be a way to say, can we bring tools from our work, from artistic practice research, into looking at these other things, into the way that we document and articulate the new ideas in these things. So just trying to capture what is practice research, what are the ways of knowing, how is it a field, how does it move across disciplines, how do we describe it, what's a narrative, who are the audiences, what does a PhD do that's different, etc. in practice research, who gets to be heard, the ethics of these all of things, the archive, etc. And bringing in many, many different voices to try and speak to these. So it's a fantastic document in just trying to lay some sort of agreed ground rules across this. What I'm not showing you here is the second report. There are two reports in total. The whole of the second report, which is about half of the entire 120-page document, the whole of the second report is leading to or investigating what might be needed to try and address a lot of the problems that we have. And their conclusion is that we need something like what at the time was called the Open Library of Sciences, which was essentially an open, as it describes, an open approach to documenting and collecting all the knowledge within sciences, the web of science, etc. And it was trying to look at how would this be done for practice? How do we sit down and both get all the practice research in one accessible place without stepping on the toes of licensing, of publishing, of all of these other things that actually make that quite difficult for artistic audiences, and capture and all of these other things. So I'm not going to dwell too long on the reports, only to say that they are well worth a read. And I think if anything, they really drew a line in the sand in 2021 to say, here's how we can maybe go forward. Something that came directly out of this then was a project that I was involved in called Sparkle, which was then looking at that question of, well, what would happen if we had some sort of open library for practice research? What if there was some sort of digital repository or hub? How would that be done was one question, but that wasn't the question we were quite trying to answer. The real question was, to what extent is there a need for one? This was an AHRC funded project, quite a short one. We had 6 months to run around and try and work this out. There was also a sister project doing this in Westminster called PR Practice Research Voices, PR Voices, and you'll see more of them as we go on. But what Sparkle tried to do, well, then you can go and take a look at our reports. I should say I'm not absolutely certain that QR code works. I hope it does, but the URLs down the bottom all work. The Sparkle project tried to sit down and just talk to a range of practice researchers across different domains and also research professionals. So research support, librarians, front-end librarians, back-end doing data management and research data. And it also, the people involved, the investigators was myself, who is a researcher, and also Claire Knowles, who is one of the directors of the library here at Leeds. So we had both sides of the equation. And it's also important to acknowledge here where libraries come into this. Of course, in the rest of the research world, libraries are absolutely central and vital because that's what happens. You write an article, you write a book, it goes in a library, it becomes findable through the library. And also things like abstracts and all of those keywords, text, etc., all those text-based things that a library provides, not to mention repositories for data, spreadsheets, videos, etc., anything else that's part of the research, all sits in the library. And traditionally, and you will see this a bit more in about 5 or 6 minutes, traditionally practice researchers have struggled to engage with this, largely because it's been designed for text-based things. But so having Claire in from the library side was really fantastic, and she drives it as well because she is coming from the perspective of we have these people doing this research and we can't get them into the library. How do we make it easier for them to engage? So the Sparkle project ran around, talked to a bunch of people. We talked to people in fine art, theatre, media, architecture, music, etc., including not just academics. There was professors, there was postgrads, There was freelancers who sit outside academia but relate to it. And then we spoke to a bunch of people as well from data, from the library, from ref, from research admin, just trying to get a picture of where the problems lie. And this was really fascinating because the problems were very different, yet they also overlapped with each other, and some problems created each other, which just went round and round in circles. But coming out of this, there was a really strong sense of the kind of things that were needed, really, was that there needs to be more about discoverability. How do I discover others people's work? How does my work get discovered? Because, of course, unless you write an article or a book or something, practice research is almost unfindable through the standard tools. Google Scholar does not index it. It can't find it. It doesn't know it exists. Unless it's being published in a traditional way, you won't find it in libraries. You can, of course, include it in various home and local libraries, or sorry, repositories, but unless you know exactly what you're trying to find, it's very difficult to actually go and get it. It doesn't just pop up in search engines. It's often not citable, etc., or at least the citations you would make to it are quite specific and not easy to trace or track down. Again, they tend to appear in journal articles. Journal articles or books will talk about a piece of art and where it comes from without necessarily actually citing necessarily the art itself or any more about it. So coming out of all of this, ways to improve discoverability, connection, relationality. How do I, as a researcher, sit down and show the different relations in my work? How do I connect my work to other people's work in a way that isn't simply citations and footnotes? How can I do it, even more importantly, on my own terms? Not having to translate everything over into text to make citations and then go back. Are there ways I can directly cite into works itself or documentation of those works, etc.? So coming out of this, we had a bunch of recommendations, and then that's when we started working more closely with the PR Voices team down at Westminster, run by Jenny Evans, because they were essentially doing the same thing, but their team was more library based. We were a bit more practice researcher based with a librarian as part of that, while they were primarily metadata and library people with some practice researchers working with them. And it quickly became apparent that we were largely pointing to the same solutions, and it was just a question of finding funding to do it and convincing the funding gods that this was something worth doing. That's where Enact comes up. I'll come back to talk about Enact in a moment, but I want to also talk about something then where we wanted to zoom in a little bit more. This is a project from just last year, and this is a project that actually was incredibly valuable, and I think if people in other institutions could do it as well, I think this, or something like this, I think we could get some really, really valuable information. But what we had out of the bigger Sparkle project was we had a very high level sense of where problems were, what things maybe needed to be done. What we didn't have was a strong sense of what individuals are doing or feeling on the ground. So the Practice Research Diaries project was actually designed to go in and spend 6 months closely observing and working with a group of specific researchers to see exactly what they are doing. How are they engaging with the library, or not even how are they engaging with the library, but when they have research stuff they want to talk about that's not going into a journal article or a book or an article, or sorry, a book chapter or a book that's not going out in a traditional form, how are they putting that out there? Where's it going? So we were essentially asking them to diarize their own dissemination, their own sharing of research. And to go back to the ref definition for research, that's one of the 3 things you're supposed to be doing as a researcher. There should be an investigation. There should be a specific investigation. There should be insights of some sort. So there should be some novelty, something that is new, and there should be effective sharing. That is, there should be a way to share these insights with people for whom they're going to be meaningful. Other researchers, other artists, people who are asking similar kinds of questions. So we were asking these, we took these 5 researchers, which included a postgrad, 2 early career researchers, a lecturer, and a professor. And we just followed them. We said, whenever you're sharing stuff, let us know. Where's it going? And a lot of what we were seeing then was things occasionally things going into the library, finished things sometimes went into the library or into our repository, but that was very rare. What we mostly saw was people doing social media posts, people putting stuff on their own website, people putting stuff on Vimeo and YouTube and places like this, whether it was completed works or snapshots of larger projects, etc. All of this work was going out to be shared with peers, mostly across social media networks, or I guess if you have a website, it's not social media, but it will be mostly people who already know your work that are going to come and find it. So this stuff was going out through all of these networks, but very often not in a way that's useful for research. Let me be clear what I mean by that. Of course, it's fantastic to share something and have peers in your area see it. And there's a very real research connection there. If there is something that I'm sharing that is insightful, even if it's not finished, if it's just a hint at something, that's where interesting stuff can happen. That's where people can look and see and come back to me and say, oh, I like what you're doing. I'm doing something similar. Or not tell me because we're both trying to get the same funding and we don't want to make each other's work better. But that stuff was happening, but it was happening in places that are very difficult to work with on research terms. You can't search Facebook to find people's research. You can't go looking for it. If you put it up on YouTube and Vimeo, I mean, it might still be there in 6 months or a year, but if anyone remembers MySpace, YouTube and Vimeo could disappear tomorrow. Who knows? There's nothing permanent about these things. There's nothing searchable. It's very difficult, other than the small network of people who's out there, to actually go and find this stuff. Unless you stumble across it, these things are not really useful in a long-term, properly networked research sense. Certainly, if you sit and compare them again to research in the humanities, research in STEM, etc., it's much more difficult to see how a practice researcher can get the same level of connection and relation and penetration, because the network is just not designed for that. So this is essentially what we were finding, was that these people wanted to share stuff, and they were happy to share stuff that's in process, and they were happy to share stuff that was just ideas, putting it out there because they want people to engage, but that there's nothing really there to allow it to directly connect and find the researchers who are also really working on these things, the people you really want to connect to. So, as I've essentially said, the short version of this, the project aims to make a snapshot of how artistic practice researchers currently interact with library research support systems and how they make their work fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Keep an eye on that fair thing. That fair is going to be coming back a lot in the next 20 minutes or so. As I said, the primary issue here then is for the library's point of view, because again, this was myself and Claire and a couple of other people on the library team that were trying to do this, because the library wants to engage. The library wants people coming in and using their stuff. And also we were working with people on the library data team who have the power to change things about the library, to make things, if needed, easier for practice researchers, etc., to take ideas on board, rethink it. The library is hungry to make this work. It's just a question of understanding the problems. So noting, of course, that library systems are largely set up for text-based things, we had a lot of conversations where we would bring in members of library staff to talk to these researchers, or to have a back and forth between the researchers and the library staff, whether that's on the front end of the library or people who are working in the back end on things like the CRIS, the Current Research Information System, things being put into repositories or for ref, etc. How is this best done? What's missing from the picture for practice researchers, etc.? One of the things that comes out of this is that inevitably in the current system, practice researchers tend to have to do a lot of translation. They have to sit with what they've got, work out what documentation is going to work best for the library, work out how they can fit into the metadata fields in ways that are useful. Now, our library has done a lot of work on this, and it has done a really nice job so far of making these things as accessible as possible. So it is possible to go in and say, well, I have an exhibition. It's not a book, it's an exhibition. So the metadata fields are going to be different. It's going to allow for different kinds of uploads, etc. But there's never enough specialized fields. We found very quickly that even with just 5 artists, the existing library, the boxes to put things in was already not quite enough. But this is again partly because there's a meeting halfway that has to happen here. Also, the researchers, the artists, have to step away a little bit from the specifics of the art and think how is this going to best fit within this system in the way that works best for me, for my peers, for my field, etc. How am I going to make this all connect? So both groups are trying to work with each other. We came up with a ton of recommendations, and I think particularly if there's people here in the audience who have the power in their institution to change systems and to change policies, you can see very quickly from the recommendations here that while the top level one is staff researchers, most of the rest of this is looking at policy and support things. And it's about partially on the side of the staff researchers developing that strategy for curating your research, thinking not just of how does my art get to my art audience, but what do I need to do to package it up in a way that it's going to best sit within a research ecosystem. How am I going to decide what needs to go into a repository, for example? On a very pragmatic level, I have a current ongoing project where I have probably 60 or 70 hours of video of rehearsals, which is useful for me as a researcher because I'm watching specific things that happen. But I don't think it's really useful for anyone else if I just take 50 hours, a terabyte almost of video and dump it up onto a repository and say, there you go, everybody, enjoy. So what I'm thinking with that is actually what I need to do is pick some quite specific moments or sections of that video, make a new video out of these that walks you through a little bit what's happening, maybe just picking some highlights. There is a question there in terms of basic research data. Maybe I should be uploading all 50 hours just in case somebody else will find that useful. I think that's a question we don't really have an answer for yet. Certainly the library would say maybe we don't need all of that. If everyone's uploading this every 6 months, that's going to be a lot of data. And we all know the current problems we have with data storage and AI, etc., etc. So there are larger questions to ask about the efficacy and ethics of gigantic piles of data. But I do think there's a certain onus on the researcher to try and narrow it down a little bit, to preserve what they can see as being important to preserve without necessarily putting up every single piece of data. But again, to do some sort of translation. So think about curating, think about ways of making this stuff available for peers and other researchers in a way that will make sense to them, not just to yourself, to myself even. Also, training and experience of repository systems. One of the direct outcomes of this, after talking to a bunch of researchers, was can we just have some more guidance on how, as a practice researcher, as a filmmaker, as a fine artist, as a theatre maker, how do I put my stuff into the library's research information system? So we made a slide deck of examples and just walking through the system and saying, this is where you should put this is what's important, which has gone down quite well, and it seems like that was an easy win. But you can also see here that most of these recommendations are going to policy level things, looking at postgrad supervisors, directors of postgraduate study, thinking about deposit formats, thinking about how a PhD student's work is going to make most sense to other researchers down the line. How is this going to be easily digested? How is it going to make sense online? Lots of things about thinking about research support, more training, resources and guidance, example banks of practice research, PhDs, grants, etc. More conversations, essentially, because as I've emphasized at the start, inevitably with practice researchers, as artists, we do tend to want to shy away from streamlined and normalized things. We always find a crack to fit ourselves into. And this happens in the library too. So what is really needed, we found for researchers, was to have a person or a team of people that you can just go to and say, here's my research, here's all my data and stuff, or here's stuff I have that is not yet documented. How best should I package this up to get it into the repository? So that meeting halfway point. I have all of these things, and which could be everything from people who feel like they have a lot of digital work, they've done a lot of documentation, they're just not quite sure how best to package it up, right down to people who walk into a room and say, "Here's a sculpture I've got. What am I going to do with this? How do I get this into your library? This is my physical object. What do we need to do?" And we talked as well about, and this is probably something that's not realistic at the moment, but we have, for example, we have in our library, there is also a content collection of artworks and historical artifacts, and there's a team specifically dedicated to taking those, documenting them, putting them into digital spaces. And in some ways, that's actually what practice researchers need too. They need almost a curation and documentation team within the institution to sit down and help people document things. I had just last year a conversation with a colleague in English who creates these wonderful book objects, which not only is she doing the creative writing aspect, but she's also making these physical books that are one-offs. And the conversation was simply to connect her to the people in fine art who make this stuff all the time and document it and know how to document it and have the right understanding of documenting it, but no one in English knew how to document it because they don't normally have to deal with physical objects. They're normally dealing with text on paper. So even just making those kind of connections was so useful. In talking to research directors and leadership, in many ways, just being familiar with what this is. I have very wonderful and sympathetic pro-deans here for research who are very much on side with the problems and the solutions that we're trying to come up with, but fundamentally, they're not involved with the thing, so it's not always obvious to them exactly why we need to do the things we do. But just trying to make things more visible, trying to make things more accessible and more understandable. And of course, so the library and IT staff taking a close look at the way the systems are implemented to try and get rid of barriers, to try and simplify things in some cases, but in other cases, just widen things up a little bit more. So something we're setting in play over the next couple of years, we hope, is to have more ongoing workshops with researchers and the research data teams, etc. So that project was extremely useful, but also, again, with my optimistic hat on, which I should say right from the start, I am a fundamentally optimistic person about these things. I really think that there are solutions coming into play and communities coming into play, such as this podcast, that are allowing us to better understand what each other's doing and see how we can do it ourselves or how we can fit that to what we're doing ourselves. Let's have a quick drink just to hold on. So this brings me on to essentially a where are we now? As I said before, the Sparkle team, that's myself and Claire, and some of the researchers here at Leeds have come together with what was the Pure Voices team, which is Jenny Evans at Westminster and some other colleagues down there, and also some colleagues at Queen Mary's, and put together a bid to the AHRC as part of the IDAH program, the infrastructure, well, you'll see in a second, the infrastructure program about funding for a digital repository specifically for practice research, one that's designed for and with practice researchers in order to both address the issues that we have historically with it being essentially a text-based system usually in repositories, and we need it to be more than that. But also what we really hope is that the tools that we're developing with these things and the understandings is something that can influence other disciplines to think other ways about how they can approach their own work. I've had no end of fascinating conversations with colleagues from places like history and some STEM colleagues and things who look at how I take an artistic work, a score and a recording, and try and convey the research insights in that. And look at that and they think, oh, maybe we should be using more video tools. Maybe we should be using more kinds of diagramming or more kinds of annotation. Maybe some of these things can actually help us. And especially getting past, again, this idea which we often see in STEM and humanities, where the practice side is treated just as a way to get to the public. Let's put a nice string quartet onto our microbiology research and it will look better. That it is about the insights that the artists can bring to something. So This project was funding started just in October, so we're still very much in the setup phase at the moment. It's a three-year funding window from the AHRC as part of, like I said, the IDAH program. Jenny Evans, Westminster is the lead for it. Myself and Claire and Neil White are co-leads on this. And as I said, also colleagues from Queen Mary's. The connections with this are quite big. One of the while I've been doing a lot of work with other practice researchers, it's been really fascinating to come into Jenny's universe as a librarian, as someone who deals with metadata and back-end data management systems. All of the connections that are happening like globally, the projects that are coming up in related areas is absolutely fascinating. Shared research repositories, various kinds of digital skills, things, collaborative digital projects. And of course, I think it's also worth saying, and there may be people in the room here who feel quite distant from this, especially if you are someone who makes physical objects. If you make physical objects, it can be very alienating to think, well, what am I going to do with where do I get to the digital bit? I make things. I make things with my hands. I'm a composer, which notionally means I write notes on paper. In reality, I spend most of my time manipulating instruments and making quite long, loud sounds in rooms and just listening to the air move. So I'm fully on board with the questions of materiality, physicality, presence, etc., that underpin such a huge part of what we do. But ultimately, if you ask me how I would effectively share my research, I would tell you, put me in a room with some people. Put me in a room with some people, I'll bring you my instrument, we can sit and play with it together, and that's how I will share my research insights with you. But of course, I can't sit in all the rooms. I can't sit with all the people. It is not feasible or even desirable to do that. So at some point, having a digital repository is the way to get to the people that you can't get to by sitting in a room with them, by one-on-one sharing of objects. As much as it's vital to always say that, of course, in many, many, not all, but many, many artistic practices, physicality, materiality are completely. Yet at some point there needs to be a translation to put things into a digital context. And what we're trying to do here is find a way to move what was and what is a primarily text-based digital universe into something that can actually work for people for whom text is quite often not the way they want to work. How can we do this through sound files? How can we do this through video? How can we do this through all sorts of other things? So this is why I say that the point of the repository is that it is for practice research and designed with practice researchers. So while all of these digital projects are really interesting in themselves, ultimately what we're trying to do here is make sure that is to bring on board the projects that make it easier for people to take what is often, not exclusively, and I recognize that there may also be quite a lot of digital media people here in the room, but for a large proportion of practice researchers, the digital is a domain that they don't generally have to step into. So looking at non-text or non-text centering approaches to this is absolutely vital. And there's so much of that going on. It's a question, though, of how we bring it into this library world that is historically so focused on text. So this brings us back to FAIR. And this was a real revelation for me, actually, 2 or 3 years ago when we started the Sparkle project. This idea coming from data management and data access about something being fair. That is, how do you, and this is not the same as open research. Open research is a different thing, overlapping but different. To make something fair is about making it findable, making it accessible, making it interoperable, making it reusable in a digital context. And I think this is the place, these 4 letters for me encompass so many of the issues, the fragmentation issues that I named right at the start of this. How we make all of these things work can really enable us to share work better, to connect with each other better, all of these things. Let's pull back one. Okay, so let me explain what I mean by all of these things. The findable aspect, again, in a digital universe, This is partly where the small element of translation comes up. But how do I make? I know I'm a composer. I should be showing you some music. It's quite hard to do that, so I'm going to hold this glass sculpture up, which was actually made by a friend. But it was part of a music project that I was involved in, a collaboration between a glass artist and me as a composer. But making this findable, and the question, of course, is findable for who? The ultimate question almost of any research project in any context is who is this for? And if we scope out the, or put out of scope the audience, as in the public artistic audience for whom I will go and I'll do a performance, and that will be artistically interesting for them. That's an audience, that's a vital audience, but it doesn't necessarily overlap with a research audience. The things that I tell that audience about the piece may not be anything to do with the research work that I'm doing, the insights, the new things that are happening. A lot of the time, and certainly not all the times by any means, but a lot of the time, the real stakeholders and beneficiaries in research terms of practice research are other practitioners in our field or related fields. So in the question of making it findable, there's a certain amount first of translation that has to happen to say what it is that I want to make findable. It's not simply the art. I think taking a video, taking some pictures of these things, putting them up online, putting some videos or recordings of performances online, I think that goes a certain distance. And I think if someone out there who was looking for exactly the same kind of questions as me came across that, let's say someone else who's also trying to find a way to turn a piece of glass into a performable score, there's a question. How do I make a performable score out of this piece of glass? If someone else is asking largely the same question, they'll look at my work and click. They'll either see, well, that's something I've tried already, or they'll see something new. But that's always going to be quite a small audience. If you want to get any wider than that, a certain amount of explanation, explication, talking about it, writing about it, diagramming about it, drawing about it, adding more layers, adding more description of what it is you are trying to do is going to be vital. So this is part of the findability aspect. A repository that enables you to make these things findable. I'll show you a more multimedia example in a moment, but primarily then this is about making a repository where, as well as putting in things like keywords, abstracts, narratives, other text-based things, you could also be putting in any kind of multimedia documents around this, which, using current technology, should be able to be turned into searchable transcribed documents as well. So it's not just a question of having a video there and you'd have to watch it in order to find things. They could also be automatically transcribed, so they are searchable in that way. They can be found through keyword searches, through text searches, etc. Also, and you'll see an example of this, well, a speculative example of this in a moment, using modern things like the IIIF, which is the International Image Interoperability format, which is a relatively new format that was designed for museums and galleries to be able to take really large, detailed images of things and make them searchable and citable in different ways. I'll show you an example of that kind of thing in a moment, but to be able to think about these not purely in terms of text. So making this stuff findable is a big part. Making it accessible, making it so that we don't have to rely on things like YouTube's, Vimeo's, personal websites, other things like this, which could disappear any moment. Making a repository that is, to all intents and purposes, going to be there for all time, allowing that kind of thing is really important. Also, we have to think about a fundamental issue that often comes up for practice researchers is the problem of where we've got some sort of, we have process. I have multiple compositions that all form part of one big continuous research question strand. And at some point I can say, well, this composition is finished. I can put it into a repository, but it's not the whole project. Asking ourselves, when is the project over? When should I start communicating it? It's quite difficult. They're not always single, simple things. So making that accessible as well, making it clear where the process is, where things relate to each other, how does this piece relate to that piece, both within my work and also outside my work, is absolutely vital. Interoperability is largely a technical question of just making sure that different libraries can talk to each other and different file formats can talk to each other. But again, once you're translating these things into the digital realm, being able to ensure that they can speak to each other is vital. And again, there's a lot of new technical means are coming online to make this easier. Inevitably, it still means that if I'm doing work in a fairly esoteric area with a very specific file format, I might need to upload both the specific file and then something like a PDF or something that is simpler and maybe not usable, but shows what's going on in order to make something accessible. And lastly, reusable. Reusability for artists in particular is quite a tricky point, especially if you're in an area where your work is also published by a commercial publisher, or there are various rights coming in from exhibitors or curators. Often the actual work itself in its artistic form is not something that you can just pick up and share with everybody. So this means finding ways to think about, well, if you can't share the work itself, can we share versions of it? Can we share examples? Can we share smaller aspects? Can we share different kinds of documentation? And giving researchers the control over that is vital. So giving researchers the tools and control to be able to say, well, this thing is here and reachable. And again, especially from an ethics point of view, if there are ethical reasons why you can't share specific aspects of the data or share them only with certain types of other researchers, this again are the tools we want to be able to include. My speculative example is looking at a piece of mine which, if I start on the right from the traditional, and Agatha, I will wrap up within the next 3 or 4 minutes.
Oh, no rush, Scott. Take your time. Absolutely.
So the example on the right is what I would probably put out from a purely artistic perspective. There is a video performance of this violin piece. There is a score. I can put that stuff out there. It sits currently in a repository. It has a DOI. So while there is a version on YouTube and there is also a version on my website, those are aimed largely at more kind of artistic audience. But for a researcher, they're also available on the repository for as long as the University of Leeds repository stays active. So that's there. But if we go backwards through thinking about where the insights really come from, I think somebody again who's very close to the kind of questions I'm asking might look at this piece and spot things that are interesting about it. I think that's definitely the case. But for people who maybe aren't quite as close, a lot of the research insights actually emerge through the process rather than in the finished object itself. And I'm very aware that this varies gigantically across the spectrum of artistic things. For some people, it really is about finish the artwork and then think about what is it that's shareable or where are the insights. For me, I'm much more of a process person. Most of the things I think are interesting in this emerge much earlier in the process. Like down the bottom here, pointing to the moment that myself and the violinist worked out a very specific technique that we feel is completely new. Or, well, it relates to many other techniques, but this particular thing is doing something that none of us have seen before. So that's a shareable video process. That's something that we can share. There are points along the way where we have various kind of sketches, demos that show things happening. And something that the IIIF format can do is to be able to cite from within a data stream, to be able to say, here we have a piece of audio, rather than just saying, go to minute 1 and 22 seconds of the audio, and there's the thing. You can actually create a URL straight out of a chunk from within the thing. What IIIF allows you to do is to take tiny snapshots of things and assign to them their own URLs. So you don't have to share entire images, entire audio files. You can just reference specific things within them, which I think is a game changer for artistic citation, to be able to point to something specific rather than just say, here's the whole work, figure it out. To be able to point at something specific and say, here's the bit that something really interesting is happening, cite that. So this is something, of course, work in progress. The IIIF format exists. It's out there. It's being used by a lot of museums and libraries already to do things like take a gigantic image of a nice 3rd century Persian rug and focus in on exactly what's happening in a particular part of the weave, etc., to make it easier to display online. But I think it really opens up all sorts of possibilities for people working in different artistic fields. And then zooming out from that and thinking, well, that's a particular work. That's one object. That's sharing the insights with that. How can then the platform also share connections between my larger work? can I cite from within this or connect this to the cello work I did that does a very similar technique but not quite as developed, or a piano work I had done the year after that, which again is related to this but not quite dealing with the same questions. So to be able to share, network, and create relations within my own body of work to show how the same research questions come up in different places, to show how different research questions cross-pollinate each other and relate. This is absolutely vital. Similar, to be able to sit back with that and then pointing out to other people's work, to be able to take moments, objects, items, files, examples from within various parts of my research output and point out to other people's work to make connections across those. Again, I think it really opens up the findability aspect, the accessibility aspect, all of these things. And yes, of course, there is a certain amount of additional work in this. This isn't just a matter of taking my performance, slapping it up in the repository, and this all happens accidentally. Curation is a active thing that has to be done. And equally, yes, there is the danger that by curating what I think is interesting, I maybe move out or disappear some things that someone else might find interesting. This, I think, is an emergent issue that we need to work with this for 10 years to start to see how we deal with those kind of problems. So I acknowledge those are there as issues at the moment, but I think that's going to take some working with before we get to a solution. So, in summary, what Enact wants to be is a repository that researchers and institutions want to use. This is vital. Something where your work looks interesting, is findable, and where you actively want to put things in there so that it actively connects with other people's work. Particularly around promoting discoverability, making your stuff findable, finding other people's stuff, affording relational networks across your own work, within your own work, and across other people's work. And why is this a big funded project? Because it needs consultation. We can't just build this thing on our own. It has to be done in co-design with everyone who's working in it. So that's really what the next 2 or 3 years for us are about. Building incremental, small-scale versions of this, working with specific projects and institutions as kind of pathfinders to see what thing that needs, and then constantly coming out to talk to people in all sorts of different fields and see, does this work for you? Have we missed something? Is there something else that can be in there? But all of this pushing against what Maria Delgado back in the PRAG-UK reports described as the ref graveyard. The idea that we put all this effort into documenting our stuff for ref and then it just disappears. It goes into a box somewhere and no one ever gets to look at it. Even if you go back now and look at various universities' ref output websites, some of which exist, a whole bunch of those things are already dead. Dead links, things you can't read, things that no longer go anywhere, etc. So it's just trying to make this work available in perpetuity for whoever needs it, academic or non. I think that's all I've got. Is this a slide? No, it's just a thank you. I hope that was useful for people. Very happy to take questions, etc. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Scott. That was absolutely fascinating, and I apologize because my dog just woke up and he's barking, so I hope he's gonna get quiet in a second. I have so many questions and so many comments, and we already have some comments and questions in the chat from Alan, which we'll take in a second. But I'm just gonna say it's just really incredibly important what you're doing, and I know we had this conversation so many times in the past, but you know, just all the benefits of having this kind of platform where, as you rightly say, you can just even find somebody's work in the first place. Because at the moment, you know, I'm thinking just, you know, a very, very simple example of PhD students who are working with creative practice. And unless they're aware of a specific person's work that they can follow through their, you know, respective websites or, as you said, social media, whatever that might be, it's usually a really huge hit and miss. Because there isn't really any place to go to where you can just discover those things and access them. And it's just mind-blowing when you think about the fact that we function pretty well as a community without having that, because it's so essential for it. Would be just such an amazing thing once you finally manage to actually complete it. So I just wanted to, before anything else, just say that it's just so admirable, so important what you're doing here. And I realize how challenging it is and how many obstacles you have and will have to, in this process. But that's even more important to just really, pursue that. So just wanted to say before anything else, just genuinely like a huge thank you on behalf of all the community of creative practice researchers, because I think it's just so important. So I think I'm going to ask Alan if he wants to unmute himself first and just ask the question, or would you prefer me to just read it from the chat, Alan? Do you have a preference?
Happy to read it, Agatha.
Yeah, go ahead.
How are you, Scott?
How are you, Alan? Good to see you.
Good to see you. And thanks very much for this presentation. I should preface my question by saying I missed the first half an hour because of another commitment. So I hope if you've covered this before, just ignore me and tell me to watch the recording. So I'll just read what I said there. Academic filmmakers working with found footage, so people like me who would also use feature film footage under variations of fair use ideas, regularly incur copyright takedowns on commercial hosting platforms, as well as being subject to the kind of instability of those platforms that you mentioned. Would you agree that we need a supra-institutional repository to host such work robustly and allow it to be embedded on journal platforms, etc., like in Transition and so on? Although Open Library of the Humanities now use their own Vimeo account to host video. Supra-institutional, because university legal departments tend to be defensive and cautious. I'm being a little bit euphemistic there. Whereas a dedicated repository with proper investment in fair use and its variations may protect it better.
Yeah. I wish I had a good question for you. In principle, at least I wish I had an operational answer for you that say, yes, this is a thing we think we can do. It's definitely out of scope for us to address the larger issue of copyright. What I think we want to be able to do is to make something where we can at least push back with this. But at the end of the day, as you well know, copyright is largely a question of who has the biggest gun. If you can afford the lawyers, you can push back against things. If you can't, or if you're up against things like YouTube, etc., where there's just zero accountability, there's very little can be done. So to answer your general question about a supra-institutional repository, yeah, I completely agree. And I mean, equally, speaking personally here, while I acknowledge that copyright can be a useful thing sometimes in certain domains, in the academic world, it grinds against our basic onus, which is to share things, the ability to share things. So there is a real tension between these things. Ultimately, what we'd like an act to be able to do is find ways to make this as possible as can be done under the current legal conditions. As you say, what we really need is a body that will stand up for us to do these things, to fight for fair use. As it is, that doesn't exist, and universities won't do it for us, and the government won't do it for us. So it is still largely us against corporations. Sorry, I'm slightly waffling now. It's not a great answer, but
I guess what you're slightly saying actually is that people like me who are now based in, how would I put this, continental Europe, should be pushing the EU to do something about it. Even if then you come up against their own sort of data protection regulations, which can be incredibly bureaucratic.
Yeah, I mean, and in truth, this is not, you're at the coalface of dealing with these kind of takedowns and the legalities of these things, and the extent to which fair use just gets completely ignored by large companies like YouTube's, etc. They don't care. They don't have to care. It's easier to just ignore us behind a wall of takedowns. But I mean, obviously, I think the EU should absolutely be fighting for the academic freedom aspect of being able to make fair use content with this. It's not a problem Enact is going to be able to solve. However, as we go through developing this stuff, it's people like you who we need to talk to see where are the tension points where we perhaps can lever things in certain directions, ideally. Ongoing conversation. I'll be coming back to you on that. Sorry, Agatha.
No, I was about to say that what you're both talking about also leads to one of your points, Scott, when you said, well, this is only really going to work if it's something that researchers want and can use, because if you just have a fraction of people being able, for whatever reasons, submit their work or deposit their work over there, but it's still not giving us the kind of bigger picture, then obviously that's a challenge. And one of these challenges is to do with copyrights. Some other would be with any institutional frictions, if you like, of different sorts. So that's why I was saying, like, I realize how many complexities you would have over there. And also, before we take Lee Jane's questions, like, I found it really fascinating when you were talking about this idea of other types of creative practice where the question of documentation is actually quite difficult. And obviously, beautiful example of a glass sculpture. We had a informal chat about a piece of 3D printed. I don't know how do I even call it. Do you want to show us what it is? I'm just very interested. And then I'll kind of ask my question.
It just rolled across the room.
Oh, I'm so sorry to make you move.
We were talking earlier about, this is, as I said, I work with instruments. I've recently designed these little things which go in between the strings of violins and cellos and things, and make all sorts of fun inharmonic and nonlinear sounds occur. So it's a fun piece of low-tech technology for experimenting with what you can actually do on a bowed string instrument. But you've also made me think, and Alan's question. Yeah. Sorry, go on, Agatha.
Go on.
Well, just bringing this up to something that I should have said during the presentation as well, around institutional things coming from what Alan was asking, that there is also with this the big shadow of ref and what you're talking about, communities. Yes, like any platform, this will only work if a tipping point majority of people start to use it. Now, there's a way which came up in conversations several times around, well, if institutions decide that this is something that will be useful for ref, then institutions will force people to use it, and then everyone will be on board. But that is absolutely not what we want. We are being very clear to both funders and institutions, this is not a tool for ref. This is a tool for the practice research community. We will make it easy for research and ref administrators to make use of it, to build portfolios and whatever, but ref will be a beneficiary of this, not a point. So again, there is no way to strong arm the community into this. That would be terrible. Can you imagine how awful that would be if this is just something where everyone was forced to use? No, the whole point about this is to bring people in because of the benefits, because of how it helps us, not how it helps.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I think it's really clear where the benefits are, and there's plenty of them. But just to come back to my question, I was trying to kind of formulate before I diverse and ask you about your 3D printed object. Do you think, because as I said, I was really fascinated when you were talking about the way of documenting different formats of creative practice. And obviously, photography and video is one of the most common way of addressing that, whether we're talking about, someone performing or an object or anything like that. Do you think this is helpful for us to have a standardized way of using, let's say, for now, photography and video as a way of addressing that? Or do you think, again, as a community, we should be a little bit more free in terms of how we do it? So I just imagine, just to give you a complete kind of extreme example, imagine I'm looking at that sculpture and my way of documenting it would be by writing a poem. Would that be something that we would think is appropriate? Or do you think we should have some kind of more? And again, there's a reason I'm asking about it, because again, thinking about things like ref, and again, completely agreeing with the other points you made. Obviously, we want to make it international as well. So ref is a very UK-based thing. So it's not going to be relatable to everyone who might be benefiting from the platform, because I think it only would make sense if you are able to grow it into, a more international, landscapes. But yeah, going back to the question of the documentation, do you have an opinion? What do you think is more useful? Because I can see benefit of both ways of addressing that. Whether, I'm rambling right now. I'm just going to ask you to answer it if you could.
So what's really interesting, again, I'll go back to the practice research diaries example very briefly. Just we had these 5 researchers in. a poet, a creative writer, a media, someone who made documentaries, basically, someone who did installations, and someone who does photography, as their basic things. And we were looking at, well, how do you put this stuff into our CRIS system, into our research information system? And our research information system has all these categories like exhibition and composition and play and media thing. And 4 out of 5 of these researchers could not find the place where they belonged in that. Even though we had the superstructure of things, the nature of artistic practice research always has to be, there will always be an exception, and that's what we do. In the same sense that we have lots of conversations around drop-down lists, so we need to make a drop-down list for all the possible different domains and disciplines involved, and there always has to be an other, because there's always going to be someone who doesn't quite fit into those categories. Part of what we're doing here is also just trying to reduce the reliance on other, because otherwise we just always get swept into this big category of whatever. Exactly. So that's just a larger thing of saying I absolutely do not think we need standardizing. And I think also the pressure from this, and Alan is very familiar with this, like the current move towards video is really interesting, coming out of people doing videographic criticism, and then I'm looking at this film and media based videographic criticism, and then I'm looking at other people who are then doing that in theater and looking at how you could do that in music. And as soon as you standardize it in one direction, someone in another domain says, oh, I like that bit, but I don't like that other stuff. Like that's, I think there are trends, and by trends, I don't mean fads. I mean trends as in people coming together to agree that this is a useful way to do things. And then those instantly get flipped over. It's like the universe of methods. You go out there, you see words like ethnography and various different methods thrown around. But then as soon as you look closely, there's a million different schisms of these things. I think a system has to enable schisming. It has to enable people going off and finding their own way of doing things, yet still being able to create relational links back to other people doing it a different way.
This is very important. But I think, and I'm so sorry, Jane, I promise you I'll stop following up questions in a second. In fact, why don't you just go first, and then I keep it for later? Go first, because otherwise I'm just overtaking it.
Are you sure? No, that's fine. Hi. I think, I mean, this is kind of, I mean, to me, it's revolutionary stuff. I mean, I've been doing kind of practice research since I did my PhD some 25 years ago, where I was trying to, literally what I did for my PhD was do it mostly written with one chapter that had a website of material that I put in, my own links and pathways. That's what had to be the research, the part of the PhD. But the website existed, and then I showed my pathways to it. And this was even before dynamic websites, so, and obviously that's what I was kind of trying to point towards. So seeing you put that the process on, and this triple I, with a triple I, I've just looked it up, but the triple IF kind of formatting, that sounds fabulous, and also exactly what I feel. I'm a filmmaker, I'm in fiction filmmaking, is that we need to actually show the process of making, because there's so much mysticism and magic involved in how films, particularly fiction films, are made. And us as researchers are trying to expose that. It's called it's a Barbara Bolt kind of term of the tissue of making, which is beautiful, isn't it? And yeah, and I thought that was it. That image I saw of the process, and and seeing a little bit of this curated and a little bit of that over there. It's kind of getting towards something which does expose that process. Which is fascinating. So my point being, now my question to you now is, I'm actually at a place where I've done a film. I've written research because that's my training. That's what the PhD made me do. And now it's a case of, what do I what should I be thinking of doing with the documentation of the making that I did in order to sort of prepare it in some way, or get it, or move it towards being in some kind of repository that could take it?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because it really is case by case, and I mean, I feel what you're saying as well in how we get trained and the things we get trained to do, and I feel like there's a whole bunch of new and interesting tools coming out, and if nothing else, what I really hope that we start getting from this process is just more sharing of examples and seeing how other people do stuff. And, the laws of nature will come into play, and some things will be favored and some things won't be. But at least they're accessible to people and people can see how did someone else do it. Thinking about your specific case, I mean, I have to say, as much as the ref is a pain in everyone's ass and terrible in all sorts of ways, I do find it a useful process to sit down and go, well, how am I going to package up this bunch of work as a ref output? Because that's it's a similar kind of question. How do I sit and look at, say, I don't know, these 10 different pieces of music I've written with video and scores and all of these performances and things that I know are related to each other and I know have the same kind of insight, just from different perspectives. How do I package that up in a way that a researcher coming to it doesn't have to wade through all of it to start to get something that I can kind of hold their hand a little bit? And and I think it is also quite difficult for us as artists often to see what is it about what we're doing that's unique and novel that we want to share. So going through that process, what I found really useful is buddying up with other people, often in quite different disciplines, and just sharing and bouncing ideas off each other and coming and saying, okay, well, here's all my pieces of music, and I think they're doing this, and here's how I'm trying to communicate it. Does that make sense to you? I found that a really useful process. Sometimes you get lucky and it's someone who is quite connected to the ideas you're talking about. Sometimes they're not, but also then it's useful to have a perspective from someone who's sympathetic but doesn't really understand it, but they want to understand. So I think this is where the translation and communication aspect comes in. It's about sitting and thinking, what do I think is important here, and how do I get that across in a way that simultaneously holds someone's hand but doesn't flatten it out and remove all the depth. Yes. This is a criticism that comes up all the time. Someone says, well, and this is a criticism that I've seen often leveled at ref as well. What happens is the 300-word statement gets assessed and no one looks at the work, which I know from talking to ref analysts is not what happens, but it's a perception. So, but thinking then, how do I create just enough documentation and direction, whether that's a poem or whether it's a video or whether it's a short piece of text or whether it's a diagram, that just invites someone in to say, all right, now I need to go and look at the work and see what thing is in there and see what I can get out of it.
Right. I think it also brings the idea of a new type of literacy you need, because, I can imagine some people saying well, actually, I want to make a video about this, piece of my creative practice, but I'm not good at doing that. And maybe, so it opens up new, really interesting opportunities. I personally am also very optimistic when it comes to things like that. And I see it more like a really fascinating learning opportunity. And I think two other things you both mentioned here, actually, all of us really, is number one, the question that really very often the process is what brings this new contribution to knowledge, which is really the whole essence of research of any kind and shape or form, whether this is practice or not, whether this is music-based, film, whatever, it doesn't, you name it. So it is rather fascinating to be able to just, focus on that, really think very carefully what kind of elements of research it brings and how it links to what other people might or might not be doing, which is what you talked about when you gave the example of a lady you were looking to get in touch with from the US. That's really interesting. And I think to be honest with you, it just, in my head, it just brings more opportunities for us to create those connections, as you rightly said, across disciplines, because I genuinely think we can learn quite a lot from people from different disciplines. And as we all know very well, we're really siloed when it comes to, like, you're a musician, you're going to be going to conferences related to music, you're going to be going to publishing things related to music. Obviously, I'm simplifying, but in general, that's what it is. Lee, Jane, and myself will go to things related to filmmaking and so on and so forth. Where is the place where we can just actually talk to each other about what any kind of creative practice research might mean, and what this process looks like, and how even this idea of documenting different forms and shapes of research can be created, maybe in a new way, maybe looking into just slightly new language which can speak across different disciplines. So I think it's really fascinating. I think there's lots of work to do, to be done over there. But I really think it's just really genuinely really interesting, and it opens up new opportunities also for collaborations. And I think Lee Jane has a comment, I think, to add to that.
Well, just the thought there that could there be a conference, a big conference where people like yourself, Scott, are, and we bring in all of those, because I know as a PhD researcher, I was going around to visual anthropology, ethnographers. And within their disciplines, they were all talking about how to use visuals within their research, and I learned quite a lot from them. But somewhere where, particularly because they were researchers using a tool, but this would be kind of like the artists, the practitioners that are, the practice researchers, you say, that would be a fascinating conference, wouldn't it, to bring in all of these ideas.
Yeah, and there are some things that are ongoing on that already. There's the wonderful Capturing Creativity conference, which is run by Bath Spa, which is easy for us to miss because it's primarily aimed at librarians who are trying to manage the capturing of our creativity in a certain extent, capturing not being a great word. So, but this is where I really think that subject area, discipline area things have to come together more. We're a very isolated and fragmented bunch, and it's hard for us to find each other. So I mean, I'm very aware of the political economy of this stuff too. Like none of us have the time or energy to start running conferences, but somewhere along the way, I think more of that is going to start happening. I mean, certainly within my own institution, this is a thing we're aiming at in the next 6 months, is to have a kind of a show and tell of practice researchers developing. It's ref focused because when you make something ref focused, people suddenly pay attention and put money behind it. But fundamentally, it's still doing the same kind of things. It's a bunch of practice researchers coming together from different fields, showing each other how they're using different kinds of documentation and articulation to make this stuff work. And as I said earlier, when I saw the way that people in film were using video, the videographic criticism stuff, I was looking at that going, okay, well, I don't have film, so the kind of tools you're using, the kind of ways you're doing things, like isolating bits of film and repeating them and looping them and slowing them down, that's not going to work for my research questions. But I can think of analogous ways that I've been ignoring that I can use video and annotation and all sorts of things that I hadn't thought of using before. I've learned so much, even though I'm not doing exactly what people in videographic criticism are doing.
Yeah, it's rather fascinating. Now, I'm aware of time. I know it's already 1 minute past 5, and I know we could definitely continue this conversation for another hours or so, but let's keep it for another time. So just kind of one sentence to wrap it up in terms of the answer. So I am in agreement that there is lots of isolated things going on here and there, and I am aware of other conferences that are looking at things like that. But it goes back to one of the main problem you started with, Scott. Like, we are all doing all sorts of things here and there, but it's kind of not consolidated. And I guess this is what you're really nicely trying to address with your project. So I hope it's a nice wrap up for what we're talking about. I'm incredibly grateful for your time. I know how busy you are at this time of the year. So massive thank you, Scott. And again, we really all just incredibly excited about the whole idea of the repository. I hope it goes great. We're all gonna hugely benefit from what you're trying to do here. So yeah, and I'm hoping we're gonna have more conversations about what it means and how it develops. So thank you so very much, and have a lovely evening. And thank you everyone
Thank you very much. Really great to be here. Thanks everyone.
Thank you. Bye bye.